Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva vayelech Charana. Yaakov left from the place we know as Beersheva, and he went to the place of Haran. Within this small verse, we need to be able to take strength when we find ourselves outside of the environment and the milieu that we are familiar with, the comforts of home, value system that is intact, a traditional lifestyle. I think every year on Thanksgiving weekend about the many kids from our community who have gone and presently are attending college in various places throughout the United States and around the world. I want to speak to you tonight about that which has gone viral. It's a virus. It's very powerful and contagious. It has to do with the way in which we think as Jewish people. What we think about, that's one thing, but how we think about the categories of the world and the challenges that we face, particularly in these moments of great intellectual currents. Not all of the great intellectual currents are great in the moral sense of great in the sense of powerful. Powerful can draw us along and up, but it can also be a vortex that drags us down. The Zohar Kadosh teaches that if someone goes down to a deep pit, before they go there, they need to tie themselves with a rope, a strong rope, in order not to fall into the pit. Writes the Sfat Emet Cain, Vayetze Yaakov mi Be'er Sheva. That's what it means when the Torah says Yaakov left from Be'er Sheva, Shenishba la Kadosh Baruch Hu b'chol libo. Be'er Sheva means not just the well of seven, but the well specifically of oaths. He took an oath, and the oath was to commit himself to his Jewish values, knowing full well that he was on his way out of the Jewish home and into an environment that would present challenges and perhaps very subtle threats to the morality that he had learned in the home of his parents. We are on guard, wrote Carl Jung, against contagious diseases of the body, but we are exasperatingly careless when it comes to the even more dangerous collective diseases of the mind. I'd like us to consider what it means that Yaakov Avinu is the individual, first, who leaves his home, which was already established as a Jewish home. When Avraham set out, he was the home. He was rejecting that which had come before. Yitzchak never left home. Gur ba'aretz hazot. But Yaakov, he had to strike out with his staff and perhaps with a little jug of oil and something to eat and to drink to take with him. And he moved out on the way. The Sfat Emet says that's why Yaakov Avinu is the one who is associated with the prayer of the nighttime. Chazal write that Yaakov tiken tfilat arvit, shalayla nikra erev. The nighttime is also called the erev. And erev means sheyesh lo ta'arovet. There's something that's mixed up. The ta'arovet of tov v'ra, an admixture of good and bad. The need to constantly try to feel one's way through the darkness. V'humatze betoch ha'ta'aruvot hanekuda hatova. He found the good point within that admixture. Yaakov Avinu was the trailblazer. He was the first to go out, and therefore the prayer of nighttime is the time when one's ideas can become confused. There's a murkiness, an uncertainty, an admixture. And we're living in such a time now. Many, many examples abound. I want to urge everyone who is listening to this drasha to take the time to look up an article by Bari Weiss. She was working for the New York Times, you may recall, until this past summer when she left for various reasons. You can read also online. There's an article online, tablet magazine, called Stop Being Shocked, which I believe is an important article, a wake-up call to some of the way in which the intellectual currents of the day, some of which might have positive components to them, have also taken on a cast that has divided the world into binary systems of people who are good and people who are evil. There's a religious zeal, a fervor to some of the intellectual currents of the day. And I think Bari Weiss really diagnoses it in a very strenuous manner and puts us all on notice. She writes, among other things, that some of the moral relativism of today, where everything is on one level binary, You're either good or you're evil. Just like that, almost in theological terms, there's also the idea that all cultures are exactly on the same flattened plane. It should go without saying, she writes, that for Jews, an ideology that contends that there are no meaningful differences between cultures is not simply ridiculous. We have an obviously distinct history, tradition, and religion that has been the source of both enormous tragedy as well as boundless gifts, but is also, as history has shown, lethal. By simply existing as ourselves, Jews undermine the vision of a world without difference. And so the things about us that make us different must be demonized so that they can be erased or destroyed. So here are some examples. Zionism is refashioned as colonialism. Government officials justify the murder of innocent Jews in Jersey City. Jewish businesses can be looted because Jews, quote, are the face of capital, end quote. Jews are flattened into, quote unquote, white people. Our living history obliterated so that someone with a straight face can suggest that the Holocaust was merely, quote, white on white crime, end quote. This is no longer a fringe view. As the philosopher Peter Boghossian has noted, quote, this ideology is the dominant moral orthodoxy in our universities and has seeped out and spread to every facet of American life, publishing houses, tech, arts, theater, newspapers, media, end quote. And increasingly, she adds, corporations. It has not grabbed power by dictates from above, but by seizing the means of sense-making from below. And over the past few decades, with increasing velocity over the last several years, a young, determined cohort has captured nearly all of the institutions that produce American cultural and intellectual life. Rather than the institutions shaping them, they have reshaped the institutions. You don't need the majority inside an institution to espouse these views. You only need them to remain silent, cowed by a fearless and zealous minority who can smear them as racists if they dare disagree. Now, there's much more in this article. It's not for tonight. But this is the story of a person or a people who find themselves suddenly in an ambient culture that is not overtly hostile, but changes all of the basic building blocks of the rules of the game and begins to figure out ways in order to make things much murkier for the Jewish people. This was already set down for us by a Yaakov Avinu, witnessed by the end of the Parsha, after all of the goings on with a Lavan who cheats him, who tells him what the rules are in this place where they live now in Haran, not like where he came from, and reminds him of this constantly over a 20-year period. After all of the deceit and the duplicity, when Yaakov is already trying to get away, finally Lavan catches him and decides, after a big discussion, they're going to make a covenant and they're going to make a pile of stones. And these stones will have a name. Vayikra lo Lavan. Lavan calls the stones Yigar Sahaduta. V'Yaakov kara lo Gal Eid. Yaakov called it a Gal Eid. These are the same object. There's just two different names for the same thing. And Rashi points out Yigar Sahaduta is the Aramaic translation of the Hebrew word Gal Eid, which is a heap, which is a heap of testimony. Why? The Seforno puts it very, very succinctly. Shelo shina et leshono. Yaakov said, I will not change my language to the categories of language of Lavan. It's not that Lavan was just making an agreement with Yaakov. He was trying in subtle ways to draw Yaakov away from his moorings of a Lashon HaKodesh, a holy language, into his categories of language. If you think it's just one little semantic example, consider that just within a few verses, indeed, Lavan says to Yaakov, let's both take an oath on what we have put up here. Elohei Avraham, velohei Nachor, yishpetu beinenu. Let the God of Abraham and the God of Nachor make some kind of judgment, adjudication between us. Elohei Avihem, the God of their fathers. Vayisheva Yaakov bepachad aviv Yitzchak, and Yaakov is careful to swear by the fear of his father, meaning that which his father feared, meaning in the name of God. The Psikta Rabati, Psikta Zutrata rather, and Rashi both quote this idea that here is a very subtle change of language. It's in God we trust, capital G, or in God we trust, little g. It's the God of Avraham, or it's the God of Nachor. But the way Lavan speaks, you have your God, I have my God, I'm okay, you're okay. Everybody's really just the same. We just have different modalities of expression. And that's why the Torah goes on to say that Yaakov was concerned even to use the name God, because he was worried that it would be in Lavan's mind something totally different. So he chooses Yitzchak, who is exclusively his father, since Lavan says, well, I'm descendant of Nahor, like you're descendant of Abraham. I'm okay, you're okay. This was not okay. The translation into other cultures is something that we have been invited to do in a positive vein in terms of projecting our worldview and our values, but it's also a seduction, a temptation, and an effort, sometimes unconscious, sometimes malevolent, to create a leveling between all cultures. And this needs to be resisted. As we're coming now to the period specifically of Chanukah, we still have in our mind's eye the reality of what we said at our Pesach Seder just a few months ago, Bikesh Lavan la'akor et hakol. What does it mean Lavan wanted to undo everything? He was going to undo what exactly? God warned him, don't harm the Jewish people. So he certainly was not going to physically harm them. But he had a corrupting influence. He could lay claim to also being a grandfather of the children of Israel. Biologically, of course, he was. But the idea that he would stand and in some way in the family tree as a great influence, that is Bikesh Lavan la'akor et hakol. He sought to uproot everything because he wanted to retell the story and start to recast things with different language. The translation to another language per se is on the face of it innocuous, but just beneath the surface are all of the cultural values that come along with it. Consider well that this is indeed the story of Chanukah, a culture that is very attractive, that indeed has many positive gifts to bring to bear, but part of it is also a seduction. And when we come to Chodesh Kislev and we're getting ready for our Chanukah holiday, now is a good time to start thinking a little bit about how do we think as Jews and how do we think about the world. The world is asking us to think in certain ways. What does our tradition tell us? What are our moorings about how we ought to think about the world? I don't intend for a Drasha to be product placement, but that's why we're reading this book by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, Morality, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times, where much of the book is first setting the stage about how the world has changed so radically, even within the last few decades, and the ways in which it impacts our ability to think. The Sfat Emet reassures us, though, the Kol Zeh, everything with Yaakov in the darkness, with Mariv, trying to have a prayer for the time that is murky, realizing that he needs to really bear down the hatches, or rather, to borrow from another community's literature, he needs to be tied to the masthead lest the siren songs pull him off the ship. He takes an oath that he will connect himself, Be'er Sheva, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So writes the Sfat Emet, the Kol Zeh Haya Hachana. All of this was just preparation, Ba'avur Banav, for his own children. Shiyarad Yaakov Avinu, Alav Hashalom, B'chol HaMekomot Elu. Yaakov spiritually went down into all of these places. Sheyuchlu B'nei Yisrael Achar Leilech Be'ikvotav, so that the Jewish people, his children, the B'nei Yisrael, could go to all of these dark places in his footsteps. Ve'ein shum makom nistar v'choshech lifnei Yisrael shlo darach bo Yaakov. There is no hidden place, not in our personal lives, not in our communal life, and not in our national life as Jewish people here in this Medina Shel Chesed of the United States or anywhere in the world, where Shelo Darach Bo Yaakov, where Yaakov has not already tread in this darkness, given us a prayer for this period of time, the prayer of Emet v'Emunah, of truth and of faith. And indeed, one in which we can feel confident that as he took steps in the murkiness and was able to feel his way through, so will we be able to. But to recognize the warning signs of these dangerous collective diseases of the mind, if you will, from the perspective of the Jewish soul and its health. I close tonight with a brief one-line prayer that Rav Alexandri, when he would finish his Shmon Esrei, Hamavarach et Am Yisrael B'Shalom, he didn't say Elokai Netzor. That was another one of the Chachamim. It got printed in everyone's Sidur. He had another prayer. Batar Tzlute, says the Gemara in Masachet Brachot and Daf Yud Zayin. He would say, "Yehir et Som Lefanecha, Hashem Elokeinu, may it be thy will before you, our God, Shetamidenu B'Keren Ora, that you cause us to stand in a corner filled with light. V'al Tamidenu B'Keren Chashecha, do not cause us to stand in a corner of darkness. Val Yidve Libenu, may our hearts not be pained. Val Yichashchu Einenu, and may our eyes not grow dark." as we're going into the darkness of the winter, but looking toward the lights of Hanukkah. Let's together be those people who recognize that the holiday of Hanukkah, which is, again, of course, our encounter not only with the empire of Greece, but with the ideals of Greece, and to light the lights in the darkness. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom, and looking forward to seeing you again soon.